Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us here at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy for a discussion of the latest developments in the war between the U.S. and Iran, and in, of course, the broader Middle East. I'm really happy to be joined by our Executive Director, Rob Satloff, who is also the Howard P. Berkowitz Chair in U.S. Middle East Policy here at the Institute. Our Research Director, Dana Stroll, who's also the Shelley and Michael Casson Family Fellow here at the Washington Institute. And I'm Mike Singh. I'm the Managing Director and the Stephen D. Levy Fellow here at the Washington Institute. We're just going to talk about the latest developments, and they're coming fast and furious right now in the Middle East. I think this morning we were on the brink of a resumption of all-out war. The latest news as of June 11th here at 2 p.m. is that no, in fact, there may be a deal now between the U.S. and Iran, according to President Trump. And so we're going to try to unpack all this, how we got to this point and where we might be going from here over the course of this discussion. If you would like to join in this discussion with us, you can send your questions to the Q&A function on your Zoom screen, or you can email us at policyforum@washingtoninstitute.org. Policyforum is all one word. We're going to start by talking about the military side of this. We have had now, officially at least, a ceasefire between the U.S. and Iran for quite some time, for weeks, if not a couple of months now. And yet we've also seen back and forth military exchanges between the U.S. and Iran. And of course, the most recent of those happened just over these past 2 nights. And these were some of the most serious military exchanges we've had for some time. And so, Dana, starting with you, I was hoping you could sort of walk us through, especially since the ceasefire, what has the U.S. military been doing? And then what happened over these last couple of nights? What's going on, essentially, on the military side of things?
Well, thanks for the question, Mike, and a pleasure to join my colleagues up here. Thanks to all of you for tuning in. Hopefully, we can help you unpack the centuries of news happening about 10-minute chunks at this point. So you're right, Mike. There's been a tenuous ceasefire since after these 40 days of war, roaring lion for Israel, epic fury for the United States. And it's really hard to call this a clear ceasefire. It's been quite tenuous at best. U.S. military posture has remained quite elevated in the Middle East. And what the military has been doing over the course of this period, which has lasted longer than the actual 40 days of war, has been resetting itself, taking stock of and assessing the battlefield damage assessment, the BDA that happened in Iran, and enforcing a naval blockade of the Strait of Hormuz. So this in itself is actually an act of war. And with quite a robust naval presence, what we found out in the past 48 hours is that what the U.S. military has been doing is continuing to escort commercial ships out of the Strait of Hormuz. The other thing the U.S. military has been up to is maintaining this force level and, of course, focused on U.S. force protection. And we have seen exchanges of military strikes between the Iranians, who have launched ballistic missiles at Israel and at U.S. military bases in the Gulf, and U.S. retaliatory strikes. I want to focus in on what happened about 48 hours ago, which was the downing of a U.S. military helicopter, which was likely escorting a commercial ship out of the Strait of Hormuz. This is a really good example, I think, that crystallizes the tenuous nature of this ceasefire. It is a crowded space in the Strait of Hormuz. There is the Iranian side, who has continued to test the U.S. naval blockade with drones, with missiles and other capabilities from onshore. And we have been steadily guiding ships out as well as enforcing this blockade. So the U.S. military has, been striking at ships that have attempted to break the blockade and access Iranian ports. And it has been providing defensive support and guiding to commercial ships getting out of the Strait of Hormuz. And this is what we had happen just the other day. Go ahead.
And just to pause for 1 second, Dana, because there's a bit of a convoluted or confusing story about what actually happened with this Apache helicopter. Do we have a sense of whether, the Iranians were actually going after this helicopter, whether they successfully downed it using this one-way attack drone, or whether, in fact, this was some kind of accident?
I actually don't think it matters. The Iranian regime was using Shahed, an attack drone, to threaten freedom of navigation in the Strait of Hormuz. And just like if the Iranian regime doesn't directly uh, direct a specific attack, the bottom line is they were threatening freedom of navigation. And I actually think it's really important that the US military responded, because both friend and foe need to know that if US military personnel or capabilities are threatened, damaged, or downed, the United States military will respond no matter what. Now, I just want to catch up on the last 24 hours. Obviously, we had late breaking news right before we started this discussion, where, as you noted, Mike, President Trump had threatened to do a second wave of strikes tonight. And this time he described that not as in defense or self-defense because of the downing of the US military helicopter, but because the Iranians were too slow in responding to the US offer for some sort of negotiated end to the ceasefire, some sort of framework, and then ongoing discussions. And in this case, he threatened more waves of strikes, and he also threatened to seize Karg Island, which is really critical for Iran's oil energy infrastructure and the exports of their oil. And here I'm just going to say, first of all, generally from a military perspective, not great to forecast in advance what you're going to do and give the enemy advanced warning to prepare to encounter that. I think there was a huge risk to U.S. forces by forecasting exactly what the United States military had been directed or prepared to do. The Trump administration is going to interpret the recent events of the last couple hours that threat of military force was compelling enough to get to whatever this agreement is that President Trump says there's now consensus on. And I'll leave that part of the story there.
Dana, just one follow-up question on that. We've been talking about Karg Island for a long time, obviously. You said it wouldn't be wise to forecast what was happening. Obviously, as you said, maybe sort of that was the point, in a sense, that this was meant to be something that got the Iranians' attention, even if it never actually happened. When it comes to actually seizing Karg Island, there have been big questions as to whether or not that's even a sensible step to take, given you'd be putting U.S. ground forces in a pretty exposed position. Do you have a view on whether or not actually taking Karg Island would be somehow a game changer or very significant from a military perspective?
Well, what we don't know is, because there are competing estimates of exactly how much our military operations over those 40 days of Epic Fury really did degrade Iran's conventional capabilities. We know that their military industrial complex has been set back. We know that some percentage of their ballistic missile arsenal and drone arsenal was eliminated. We know that a lot of their air defense was eliminated. We also know that they still have ballistic missiles because they've continued to shoot them at the Middle East. We know that they have drones because they've continued to successfully use drones to target U.S. military bases in the Middle East. And we know that they still have some radars because we've still been targeting other radars during this ceasefire. The challenge with that Karg Island operation and seizing it is that it's an island, and without I think the real risk is what the Iranians would then have attacked from onshore on mainland Iran. And even though President Trump has claimed that the Iranian Navy has been sunk, the threat at sea is not the conventional Iranian Navy. It's guys in fast boats, small boats, shoulder-fired missiles, all of which could pose a significant threat to U.S. forces. And then the second order question here is the Iranian economy is already under very severe pressure. There are very serious, I think, decisions being forced upon the surviving remnants of the regime in Tehran because of how damaging and devastating the war was. And they are still not able to ship their oil because of this naval blockade. So at this point, I think there's a question as to whether Karg Island operation actually would have been meaningful at this moment in the way that President Trump hoped it would be.
And would it actually allow the United States to take control of Iranian oil exports in the way that President Trump suggested? Because, of course, you still have, as you noted, the blockade by Iran of the Strait of Hormuz, which would presumably apply then to the very vessels that would be loading oil at Karg Island and coming out. I mean, there seems to be a bit of a contradiction there.
Well, First of all, the Iranians have not managed to block all traffic in the Strait of Hormuz. In fact, we know that traffic can get out of the Strait of Hormuz. It's not that they mined everything, and we know this because we know now that the U.S. military has been escorting ships out. What the Iranian regime has done is introduced sufficient doubt and questioning, changing the risk tolerance of shippers and insurers about moving traffic in and out of the strait. And I think that's a really important point here. And in terms of Kharg Island on its own, no, that wouldn't be the definitive blow. And whether or not Iran could continue to move oil through its shadow fleet, through other islands, through other energy infrastructure, I think it would certainly be significant. But this is a regime who's managed to continue to survive and operate in the shadows despite massive pressure and massive sanctions for years, and they are continuing to run that playbook.
I think one thing that's worth noting is that all this effort that the U.S. is putting into bringing these ships out through the Strait of Hormuz, President Trump touted the fact that 100 million barrels of oil have successfully gotten through onto world markets as a result. That's about 5 days of normal exports through the Strait of Hormuz. So obviously a ton of work left to do there. I do want to back up, though, a little bit and talk about what preceded all of this, past 48 hours of activities, and we'll talk about the past 72 hours or the past 96 hours of activity. And that takes us back to Lebanon. And before we saw this latest exchange between the U.S. and Iran, we, of course, saw a significant exchange between Iran and Israel, where the Iranians fired wave after wave of ballistic missiles at Israel. Israel successfully defended against those attacks and then retaliated directly against Iran. And before today, that was the thing that everyone was worried was going to cause a resumption of all-out war. So, Rob, two questions. Why did the Iranians choose this moment to fire ballistic missiles at Israel? What happened in Lebanon that led to this? And second, what does this mean for Israel's participation in the conflict, for U.S.-Iran talks, for this whole dynamic going forward?
Yes, thank you, Mike. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Up until the last 48 hours, the big issue was Lebanon. Was that going to be the battlefield where this exploded between Iran, Israel, the United States, et cetera? And I think this round goes back to 10 days ago. If you can, which sounds like ancient history when one thinks about this crisis. But if one can remember where we were 10 days ago, there was an exchange between Hezbollah and Israel, where the Israelis were threatening to hit in Beirut, and the president said no. The president said, stop, you can't go. Well, that was, I believe, a message to the Iranians that there's a breach in the allies, as it were, and maybe you could drive an Iranian truck through this breach and advance your own objectives, perhaps even in the negotiations, if you can drive a wedge between Jerusalem and Washington. Just to give very briefly the TikTok, so that was what I call Black Monday. 10 days ago, where we are today. Then the Lebanese and Israelis had, the Lebanese government and the government of Israel had negotiations here in Washington the following 2 days, last Tuesday and last Wednesday. And the outcome of those talks was, surprise, surprise, an agreement on how each side would approach a ceasefire. They would create an intricate system of pilot zones in South Lebanon where the Lebanese armed forces might operate. But most of all, it was the President Trump, re-endorsing the idea that Iran needs to stay out. That no, I'm not going to let this battlefield be subject to Iran's ambitions. So within 72 hours, the president changed his tune on this issue. The Iranians didn't know which way was up. And so I believe the Iranians wanted to test this. And so that's what happened just a few hours later. They had Hezbollah attack again inside Israel. The Israelis believed they had American support to go to respond. They attacked in South Lebanon, in the Dakia, in the suburbs of Beirut. And the president seemed to imply Israel don't do anything further. And the Iranians retaliated against that attack in Beirut by launching ballistic missiles against Israel. This is when this crisis really became hot. The president suggested to Israel something similar to Joe Biden 2 years ago. Stay pat, take the win, as it were. And the Israelis only interpreted that as a soft no, not a hard no, and they hit back. And the Iranians got their message, a little bit of tit for tat, and it was over. And Lebanon and the Iranian effort to make Lebanon the battleground for improving its standing failed. Just a couple of observations. One, the Iranian effort, in my view, was pathetic. Let's think about this. In April 24, the Iranians lobbed hundreds of missiles against Israel. And again in October 24. Now the Iranians lobbed a grand total of about 11, easily knocked down by the Israelis. In my view, this underscored Iranian weakness, not Iranian strength. And it was in that context that the Israelis took advantage of the moment, in my view, to actually say, no, we're shutting down this avenue for Iran to try to enhance its position. And then secondly, having been shut down in Lebanon, the Iranians tried something else, which is what they thought they should do with President Trump. See how he acts on a different arena. And now we're back to what we just heard from Dana, these last 72 hours in Hormuz. So there was a Lebanon episode taken care of, at least tentatively, and now we had the Hormuz episode.
Rob, I'd like to ask for your thoughts on the narrative here in the United States about this episode is that Trump constrained Israel in their response. So I'm interested in, do you think that's the wrong frame to understand what happened? We know that there was an Israeli response to the Iranian missile attack, but there were also disclosures that there was a much more significant response planned, and that was called off. So how do you assess whether or not there is increased tension between Jerusalem and Washington right now? And if you're the Iranians and you look at this reporting, how do you understand what happened?
I mean, not even, I mean, I would go a step further, not just that sort of President Trump restrained Bibi, but that actually this effort to drive a wedge that you started with succeeded. I mean, if you look at the U.S. media, it's full of sort of, commentary that basically Trump-Bibi relationship is shot.
Right. So here, I think, if I remember correctly, you have a terrific op-ed that's just about to appear, or I won't say where, which underscores the fact that whatever tension appears between these two sides, the partnership is actually quite remarkable in wartime between the United States and Israel. And this is not a new phenomenon to see the United States and Israel have these disagreements during conflict. So yes, I do think the story is accurate that the Israelis had a bigger plan. I think my view is the president gave a soft no, not a hard no. The Israelis insisted that they needed to attack. Trump did not stop them from attacking. Trump said something after the fact, okay, you've done what you need to do. It's over. You had your fun, which I don't think it was terrific to have the president equating an unprovoked attack by our adversary against our ally with the retaliation. But be that as it may, the real test of what you're asking about, namely, where are these two allies, is when the Israelis get to see the details of whatever agreement the president claims that the Israelis have accepted between the United States and Iran, which should be happening as we're speaking. There's a lot of things that could be in there. There's a lot of things I suspect will not be in there that the president at one time said should be in there. And I'm not even talking about the nuclear. Let's just even mention any reference to proxies, for example, which is highly unlikely to be.
And we're going to be getting to all this in a second.
But that's, I think, the real test is where are they on the next step? They managed whatever differences they had over the Lebanon retaliation, and I think the next phase is far more telling.
So I'm going to start with an observation, and then Mike, I have a question for you. So generally here, U.S. policymakers and decision makers tend to think of these things in a linear way. We were at war, we were fighting, now we're talking. We're talking, so we shouldn't be fighting, which isn't really how things work in the Middle East, and generally hasn't always been the way the Iranians see negotiations versus the weight of military force or what they're doing. So Mike, based on what I've said about where we are in the Strait of Hormuz with U.S.-Iran military strikes and exchanges, what Rob has said about Lebanon and Israel and Iran, what do you think this means for the negotiations? I mean, we have some inkling here, but it's interesting that before all of these exchanges, before Black Monday, it seemed that Trump and the Iranians were circling the drain on the broad contours of a memorandum of understanding, an MOU. And so it was interesting to me that Iran, in the middle of these negotiations, after the discussions and the announcement at the State Department, then decided to attack Israel. And then this whole situation with the downing of the US military helicopter. So you have been part of Iran negotiations, you've worked on this file, you've been at the National Security Council. When you look at the history of Iranian negotiating teams and how they've approached negotiating or fighting with the United States, how do you understand what they're doing at this moment in time? And how do we understand all of that and how we arrived at this moment of potential breakthrough in the negotiations?
Yeah, on your first point, Dana, about what ceasefires actually look like in the Middle East and the fact that it's not quite black and white. What's interesting is that President Trump himself just recently acknowledged this. I mean, so he's clearly sort of, learned after working on these issues for quite some time that a ceasefire doesn't mean no fighting, essentially. It's in a way, it's a sort of statement of intent more than a statement or observation of reality, right? I think what's interesting is that, look, obviously the Iranians have negotiated with the United States for a long time. And in many cases in Iran, it's the same characters, frankly, negotiating with multiple administrations, which is quite different from how things look on our side, where you have a new set of negotiators every few years. And you can see the Iranians using similar tactics year after year with one administration after another. And what's interesting about what, Rob, you just said is that, I think that part of the Iranian sort of ploy, intent, sort of plan was to drive a wedge between President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu, because they understand that as they're trying to do a deal with the United States, President Trump will have critics of the deal talking to him and trying to convince him not to do it. Well, if they can drive a wedge between Trump and one of those most prominent critics, then maybe there's a better chance the deal actually gets through. The other thing I thought was interesting was the difference between the rhetoric Dana was describing from President Trump about U.S. military escalation and the way he seemed to regard Iran-Israel military escalation. When it came to Iran-Israel escalation, he seemed to say, okay, we don't want any of this. Let's not disrupt the negotiations. But then what we heard from him over the last 48 hours was, I'm tired of talking. The Iranians are stringing us along, and now we're going to hit them. It's an interesting contrast, and you get the sense that he's comfortable with the escalation when it's under his control. He gets much more uncomfortable when Israel's doing it or when it seems to be out of his control. Look, I think that you're right, Dana. I think we have been circling around a deal at whose core is really a trade-off, a trade between Iran reopening the Strait of Hormuz for the U.S. lifting the blockade of Iranian ports. And there are obviously a lot of details that go along with that. Number one, what exactly does that trade look like in the details? Does Iran get any more authority over the strait than it had in the past? Does it get to charge tolls? Is the U.S. going to lift the blockade and allow Iranian oil sales, or do all those sanctions remain in place and enforced? and then all the other terms that go with it, which I know that we'll get to talking about in the next part of this conversation, the nuclear issue, sanctions relief, unfreezing of assets. I think what we can say is that both sides have seemed to project or seem to believe that time is on their side. The Iranians look at global markets, they look at gas prices going up in the United States, they know we have our midterms coming up, and they frankly think that we don't have a strong stomach for dealing with those things, and they think that if they just wait, we'll inevitably cave. And whether or not we did, we'll learn only when we see the details of whatever deal has been supposedly worked out. But I think the U.S. looks at Iran the same way. We've had this blockade of Iranian ports, and you'll hear a lot of people in Washington say the Iranians are 2 or 3 weeks away from collapse. If you follow this debate long enough in Washington, you'll realize the Iranians are always 2 or 3 weeks away from economic collapse. And that's part of the challenge for making policy on this issue. And so I think that neither side has felt that they really had to make the tough compromises. And I think both sides have felt that military escalation remained an option for them. Not an option as that would be so much an alternative to negotiations, but a means of pressure to get the other side to realize that they really should take the deal, that their alternative to a deal was not a better deal, or the status quo somehow being okay, but was actually a far worse situation for their economies, a worse military situation, and so forth. And I think, in a sense, that's what we've seen play out over the last 48 hours. We've had all these bombastic threats from President Trump. Sort of, we're going to destroy every power plant, we're going to destroy every bridge in Iran. And I think those have not generally been credible. I don't think the Iranians have really believed that the U.S. would do that. I think they understand the U.S. can do that the U.S. has that capability. I don't think they believe that we would do it. And so I think that what's happened, you could argue, and we'll see what came out of it over the last 48 hours, was a different approach. Instead of bombastic threats, we actually had what seemed to be the beginning of a much more sustained increase in the application of military pressure. And my guess is that would get the Iranians' attention much more than the threats themselves. This sort of patient application of military pressure, as opposed to sort of bombast. I imagine that both sides still want a negotiated agreement. In fact, we maybe have a negotiated agreement. I'm saying all this in a qualified way because, of course, we still haven't seen it, and things could change. Maybe things have changed already while we've been sitting here, frankly. But it does seem as though both sides have really been following actually a pretty similar playbook, which is that, sort of war is negotiations by other means and vice versa. And who comes out on top there, sort of depends not just on capabilities, where the U.S. clearly has the edge, but on really the sort of will to persist and to endure hardship and to fight and so forth. I'm curious just to briefly loop back on Lebanon in terms of where does this actually leave us in the Lebanese context? So have the Iranians now effectively established a red line on how far Israel can go? I mean, will Israel now have to think twice about bombing Dahia? Will they have to think twice about going after Hezbollah outside of southern Lebanon? Is this going to preserve Hezbollah effectively as a military force, or is this just going to pass and then Israel will continue?
So it's a good question. The key variable here is actually how the Lebanese government holds firm on the agreement they reached with the state of Israel just a week ago. They reached an agreement whereby Hezbollah, with under the pressure from the Lebanese armed forces, is supposed to leave South Lebanon, and little pockets of area will then become the responsibility of the Lebanese armed forces. But at the same time as what Iran did with missiles, the Iranians also played another game, a pretty dirty, messy game inside Lebanon, and they're working with Hezbollah's ally, a man named Nabi Berri, the Speaker of the Parliament, who's been around since I think Hiram and Solomon were running the show for these two countries, to undermine this agreement. And so what we don't know is whether the government of Lebanon is going to actually implement that part of the agreement. If Hezbollah hits inside Israel itself, I remain quite convinced that the Israelis are going to hit back. I mean, this is not only a strategic interest for Israel, It's a political interest for the government of Benjamin Netanyahu as he approaches elections right around the corner. So I don't think they've established deterrence against Israel on that regard.
And just a coda on Lebanon, Dana, I wanted to ask you because obviously you were Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Middle East during the previous administration. You worked a lot with the Lebanese Armed Forces and on this Lebanese security file. We've been aiding the Lebanese Armed Forces for a long time in the hopes that they could take on Hezbollah. Your hopes for whether it's going to work this time?
So I think the Lebanese armed forces have the training and they have the capabilities to do this if they want. One, it's an issue of political will. And part of the challenge here, I think, is a narrative that many ascribe to when it comes to Lebanon, that trying to disarm a group that has painted itself as the legitimate resistance against Israel would cause civil war inside Lebanon, as opposed to this is a group that is holding Lebanon back from realizing and fully recognizing its own sovereignty. And actually, the Iranians dictating to Hezbollah what Hezbollah will do to escalate against Israel is what is terrible for Lebanese civilians and holding Lebanese society back. And if Hezbollah could be dislodged, not only disarmed militarily, but disentangled from the social and economic fabric of Lebanon, it would open the doors for international investments, Gulf, international financial institutions, more US assistance, more European assistance, et cetera, and engagement. So this frame of this risk of civil war, I worry, lowers our expectations for what we should expect from a partner who for more than 20 years has received training and equipping from the United States. Secondly, however, what we're asking the Lebanese armed forces to do is really significant. They have traditionally been focused on counterterrorism, ISIS and Al-Qaeda, border security, and some maritime issues. They have never actually been tasked to disarm from the inside Lebanese Hezbollah. And Lebanon's economy for years now, since the Beirut port explosion and even before that, has been on a very serious downward trajectory. The value of its currency, very hard for soldiers in the Lebanese army to take care of their families on the diminishing value of a salary that comes for a member of the Lebanese armed forces. And so if we're serious about supporting them, it's not just giving them more equipment, it's not just giving them more vehicles. They actually need medium to long-term assurances of financial support, and let members of the Lebanese armed forces need to know that if they take on this expanded mission, which also is going to mean increasing the size of the Lebanese armed forces, that there will be the encompassing system of support necessary for them to take care of themselves and have certainty about payment, about replenishment, about a sustainment, all the things that a military needs to be able to do to take on this kind of mission, which isn't going to be a one and done kind of thing.
Just one word. I agree with what Danny just said. There's one more sort of U.S. military aspect to this, which was left undetermined after the last round of talks, which is the extent to which the U.S. will play any role in the monitoring and verification of what the Lebanese armed forces is supposed to do in these areas. We played a certain role before March 2nd, when this whole problem began. We were playing a certain role, and there's a lot of talk about how beneficial it would be if the U.S. actually played a bit more of an enhanced role, actually having monitors, advisors, perhaps at a lower level with the Lebanese armed forces. And there's, I know, considerable debate about that right now.
I'm going to go ahead and offer my opinion on this one. I think the idea of placing U.S. forces at a more local, tactical, or operational level in a dynamic situation where Hezbollah would challenge it and the Israeli Air Force is consistently flying missions really increases the risk of all sorts of incidents that we don't want to contemplate. So unless the Israeli Defense Forces were willing to increase the level of operational coordination to an extent that I think would make any sovereign military quite uncomfortable. The idea that the solution here is more U.S. boots on the ground. I think there are there needs to be a way to realize these pilot zones and have a way of actually verifying the Lebanese armed forces disarming and dismantling of Hezbollah. But there's an instinct in Washington to always look at the U.S. military as the solution, and I worry that we are putting too much on the U.S. military.
So let's talk about what comes next. This is the hard part because, of course, this is all happening in real time. And let me just remind all of you who are listening that we would love for you to get on this conversation as well. So you can, again, send your questions to us using the Q&A function on your Zoom screen, or send us an email at policyforum@washingtoninstitute.org. So obviously we have this announcement by President Trump that there is a deal, that he's talked to everyone in the region and they all accept the deal, and he's going to announce the time and place of a signing ceremony. We don't know what that deal looks like, but I think for the purposes of this discussion, we assume it is something like this trade-off. The Strait of Hormuz is reopened. Is it with tolling? Is it with, ships passing closer to Iran? We don't know. The U.S. lifts our blockade of Iranian ports. Do we allow Iranian oil to flow freely? We're not sure. Do we let Iran repatriate the revenues from those oil sales? We're not sure. It includes probably some measure of unfreezing of Iranian assets, maybe a little bit up front, and then maybe some phased as the Iranians demonstrate that they're allowing traffic to pass through the strait. Maybe allows some other sanctions relief up front for the Iranians so they can say they got something. And then probably commences or starts this 30 or 60 or 90-day period of negotiations to try to get a follow-on deal that addresses things like the nuclear issue, maybe chiefly the nuclear issue and the lifting of sanctions that would come with those concessions by Iran. It may involve some upfront commitments by Iran as to what those nuclear compromises will look like, at least pointing towards them in some kind of preambular sense. My guess is it doesn't include much on proxies, and it probably doesn't include much on missiles and drones either. So first, do you guys agree with that, or do you think are you expecting something radically different to come out of this? All the listeners may already know the answer to this, of course.
I think that's a reasonable summary of what is likely to be the case. Just for the record, it's important to note that for those people who've followed this conflict since February 28th, when it was launched, unconditional surrender, as the president proclaimed, is not on the table. Regime change is not on the table. We're talking about much, much less than what the president said at various points earlier in the conflict would even be on the table. Whether or not it's even all those items you did mention, I tend to think you're absolutely right, that missiles unlikely, proxies unlikely. And at most, what we're really talking about is a extension of the ceasefire to allow for something else to happen. Maybe these talks about nuclear issues, but I think that is really a better descriptor of what we're likely to see, which is a ceasefire extension.
But with the important addition of the reopening of the strait.
Correct.
Right. Dana?
So a few observations on this. Before this most recent cycle of escalation, the parameters of what I think were becoming more clear was an agreement: we end our blockade, they end theirs. So essentially open for open, the bare minimum. All of the discussions on nuclear pushed off for either this 30 or this 60 or this 90-day period. And we saw Iranian officials message, even going on American news channels, to speak directly to the American people rather than just the leaks about this $24 billion in sanctions relief, this payment up front. So the contours of the United States insisting on really robust technical parameters and the Iranians wanting the benefits of sanctions relief up front, to me, feel very back to the future, except this time we've fought this big war. And we know that President Trump was really frustrated with the pace of responses from Iran. And that is because these guys are really scared of being targeted, because so many of their leadership, every time they have a lapse in their operational security or make a public appearance where they're not surrounded by a bunch of Iranian civilians and innocents, someone's probably going to take a hit and try to kill them. And so there are these extreme measures of secrecy to actually get messages all the way to the new supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei in Iran, in order for him to give the green light or the yellow light or the red light before those messages get all the way back to some
If in fact
mediator.
he's actually making the decisions, which we don't know for sure.
Yep, fair enough. And then we know that there's a competition among mediators. It could be the Pakistanis, it could be the Qataris, et cetera. So this has been taking a long time for some structural reasons, as well as just the general history of negotiations. In the past several days, it is unlikely, as the two sides were exchanging strikes, and then there was this news of a Qatari delegation in Tehran trying to meet them to get them back to the negotiating table. That wasn't even successful in the past 24 hours. Very unlikely that a few hours of strikes last night changed the fundamentals of this. So whatever the threats were for Karg Island and this bigger thing today, and whether or not it would have been a few more hours of strikes tonight, that was never going to fundamentally change the parameters of what this negotiation might be, unless the U.S. military and president, well, the U.S. military is prepared to do what the president says. If the president had been prepared to direct a sustained military campaign, perhaps those broad contours would have been a little different. But I think it's largely the same thing, and I really doubt Mojtaba Khamenei is going to show up at this signing ceremony.
That would be something.
That would be something.
Now, let me ask you, Dana, since you've got the mic. Okay, let's say we're all in agreement as to what the deal is likely to look like. If we're right, if that's basically the trade-off here, it's, as you said, open for open, blockade for blockade. Our Arab Gulf partners, are they thumbs up or thumbs down?
I think on that, they're thumbs up, because if there was a return to war, they already know what that looks like. It looks like the United States and Israel dominating conventionally inside of Iran, and Iran responding asymmetrically against Gulf societies, civilian infrastructure, energy infrastructure, maybe more desalination plants, airports, hotels, etc. And even though in those 40 days of hot war, our Gulf partners with U.S. support, and now we're reading Israeli support as well, engaged up in the high 80s, 88%, 89% of the missiles and drones. The 12 to 13% that got through were really devastating for these societies. And how they stabilize their economies, provide security for their people and for their economies, is premised on a calm, safe, business-friendly environment where things can get in and things can get out through the Strait of Hormuz. Some, like Saudi Arabia and the UAE, have other opportunities other than the Strait of Hormuz. Kuwait, Qatar, in a much more difficult situation. So they know that Iran is going to be able to, at least sometimes, successfully attack them and cause more damage, which means people aren't going to fly there, tourism is not going to return, business is not going to happen. And after 40 days of war, we know, even though we don't know the specifics, that munitions are down, missile interceptor stockpiles are down, U.S. military bases have been damaged, U.S. military radars to sense what's incoming and provide that early warning. Some have been really damaged. And so if there was a return to war, I think it could have been even worse for our Gulf countries. And I also think when they look at things like the reports that President Trump did try to constrain an Israeli response, and we had these experiences weeks ago where the UAE was attacked by Iran, and at first President Trump said, no, the ceasefire is still in effect. This time we're not going to retaliate. This was during that time of the Project Freedom escorts. All of that has eroded and chipped away at confidence among the Gulf countries that the United States is in it for the long term and is going to have their back. And at this point, given the pain of this blockade both ways, these guys need it to end. And I think they are thinking through what it means to live with this regime in Iran in the neighborhood.
And Rob, what about Israel? They entered this with high hopes for regime change, for, I think, a more significant result than we've gotten. So how would this kind of deal be received in Israel? What impact would it have on Prime Minister Netanyahu?
So what you're really asking is how will the Israelis react to what's in the deal and what's not in the deal? What they fear, on the one hand, is a statement in the deal that subsumes their interests in Lebanon to the broader Iran agenda, that there's some commitment that there's a ceasefire in Lebanon that is imposed as a result of the Trump-Iran deal that might deprive them of their freedom of action. That would be politically a catastrophe for Benjamin Netanyahu. And all Israelis actually would oppose this, the opposition as well. Point one. Then they're worried about what's not in the deal, kicking the can down the road on the nuclear issue, which for them is important, or kicking the can down the road or saying nothing about missiles, and certainly nothing else about proxies. So they are worried about this deal. The president may say the Israelis support it, but I think there is extreme nervousness inside the government of Israel about this. They will keep it muted to the extent that anything stays muted in Israel, but the anxiety level must be going through the roof.
Mike, can I ask you a question on this, which is, let's say it's open for open and the can is kicked down the road on everything else. Do you think that's an acceptable outcome for the United States? Like, what if there just is no deal, or there's endless negotiations on the technicalities of the nuclear file? Can we live with that?
Look, obviously, if this is the deal, a minimalist sort of deal, President Trump's going to be pilloried in Washington, in the United States, by his critics, saying, look, you went to war, you depleted American resources, you sort of caused inflation and the increase in energy prices, and for what exactly? For reopening the strait, which was open before the war in any case. I think that's unfair and really the wrong way to look at it. Why? Because I think it really depends on what happens next. First of all, I think it's important to look at this conflict together with everything else that has happened since January 1st of 2025. I think if I were in the White House, I would say, look at the situation in Iran as of January 1st, 2025. Iran was literally 2 or 3 days away from having enough fissile material for a nuclear weapon. Now their nuclear program is really sort of destroyed. They're not enriching uranium for the first time since probably the late 1990s. Their uranium enrichment facilities are, I think it's fair to say, obliterated, to quote President Trump. They probably have some centrifuges somewhere. We don't know where or how many, but it's unlikely they're in a position to actually enrich uranium. They do have a stockpile of enriched uranium, thousands of kilograms inside Iran, but as far as we know, it's not accessible easily, and we presumably are keeping a close eye on it. So really, that main threat to the United States, the nuclear issue, has been dealt with. It just hasn't really been dealt with during this part of the conflict. And so I think actually from a tactical standpoint, choosing to take this more minimalist trade-off so that you can, if you want to negotiate the nuclear deal, you're not doing it with this looming sort of pressure over you of the impact of the closure of the Strait of Hormuz on global energy markets, on global politics. I think that actually puts you in a much better position to then negotiate with the Iranians on exchanging more nuclear concessions for sanctions relief. By the way, there's no real urgent need for that. You have plenty of time to do that if you want to, because as I said, the Iranians are not close to a nuclear weapon today. You have more time if you want to negotiate on the missile and drone issue. You have more time if you want to help build the Lebanese government up without, again, that sort of pressure of rising energy prices hanging over you. So I actually think from a tactical standpoint, it's a good move. And I think from a strategic standpoint, again, the Trump administration can point to the achievements not just since February 28th, but since January 1st of last year and say, we kept this short, whether you like the outcome or not. It's not an endless war like the previous wars, and that's what we said we would deliver.
So if that's the case, Dana, let me ask you, do we keep what level of military force do you expect that we keep in the region if this agreement envisions 60, 90 days towards something? Does that provide deterrence? Does it provide pressure? Is it helpful? Can we sustain it? How do you see that part of this?
I think a sufficient level of military force posture has to be maintained in the Middle East if we're serious about negotiations beyond the open for open. Historically speaking, adversaries, but especially Iran, have to believe that we maintain real military options and a willingness to use them. From last night, I would have said the United States is backing up its threats of using military force and actually showing with proportional military. Our military was targeted. We targeted their military infrastructure. So that is signaling we still maintain these capabilities. We maintain a sufficient military presence to do it. And we have options to escalate. We're just choosing not to use them at this moment in time to give you, Iran, an opportunity to de-escalate and return to the negotiating table. And I think it's important to recall in this conversation that we're dealing with a new leadership in Iran. So yes, the foreign minister, Arachi, has been around the block many times in negotiations, but not this supreme leader and not some of the people advising him, assuming he's actually making the decisions here. So I think we need to keep in mind when we look at this exchange with Israel, what happened in Lebanon, what's happened in the Strait of Hormuz in the last 36 hours, that it is possible not only that we're dealing with a new regime leadership who's absorbing these lessons, but they might actually have judgments about what the previous regime did or didn't do and the effectiveness of that. And so there's a dynamic here. I don't know, exactly where this lands, but I think sufficient military posture has to be maintained. And this could be difficult because fuel prices are up. It means it's more expensive to maintain our forces there. And a lot of these capabilities have been deployed for an extended period of time. And the trade-offs with other theaters, with bringing people home to rest and reset, to resetting our capabilities, all of this will have compounding effects the longer it stays out there.
I would just only add to that it's important to bear in mind a couple of additional things. Number one, energy markets aren't going to bounce back right away. Our colleague Noam Raydan has done excellent work on this question of, how ships are moving through the strait or not moving through the strait and the impact on energy markets. Richard Nephew has also done great work on that. And one thing they point out is you have this long backlog of ships waiting to get out, but then ships will have to start coming in as well. So it'll take some time for the world to feel the relief. And of course, I think having our military there to make sure this all proceeds smoothly is going to be very important. Then the other question is, if in fact there's a 60-day timeline to negotiate a nuclear agreement, a timeline which I think probably strikes all of us as extremely ambitious. Look, at the end of those 60 days, if things are going well, maybe you just extend. And maybe you kind of hope the world moves on to the next issue. Maybe it's Cuba, maybe it's the World Cup, who knows. But it's also possible after 60 days you have a resumption of conflict, right? And you don't have just that extension of the ceasefire, that extension of calm. And so you need the military there to deal with those things as well.
Just to put this in the political context, 60, 90 days from now, we are in the throes of our midterm election here in the United States. If the president has said in mid-June that by end of 60 days, I'm going to get a terrific deal, then the pressure is really on him, and the Iranians get a certain negotiating advantage that only gets only grows with the political pressure of that election season.
I mean, this may be right, although my guess is that Iran gets filed between Gaza and Ukraine in terms of the attention being paid on where exactly these negotiations stand.
But I come back to your point about the potential return to military. Right. That's what I was getting at.
Let me ask you guys this, and I think this is our really sort of where we can end. Look, when initially a deal was announced several weeks ago, when it looked like we were very close to a deal, only to sort of back away from it. The Iranian foreign ministry spokesman, and maybe a somewhat premature move, posted this image of, the Byzantine emperor, Philip the Arab, surrendering to Shah Shapur of Iran, basically calling to mind an era of history where then the Persians suddenly had tremendous influence across the Levant and across the Middle East. And so is that, in fact, the near future we're looking at, a future where the Iranians are going to be throwing their weight around in the Middle East? Look, we've had this whole conflict with the Iranians, and we've not dealt with the proxies. The Iraqi Shia militias have fired tons of missiles and rockets across the region, but they're not part of this agreement, probably. The Houthis are still sitting pretty in Yemen. Hezbollah, which looked like it was on the ropes, is living to fight another day with Israel. And now the Iranians have demonstrated that they can really sort of bring the regional economy and really the world economy grinding to a halt. So you look forward. Are we going to see greater Iranian influence in the Middle East, less American influence, or is there a more optimistic scenario?
I can answer first and then let the boss wrap up. So I think how this ends in the medium term depends on a lot of decisions yet to come, and it would require the deft and skilled execution of a whole of government policy where Lebanon, Gaza, Iraq, Yemen, and maintaining an international coalition of the willing, ready, and prepared to maintain pressure on Iran, we're all working together. And that will require sustained focus and investment and attention from the Trump administration when there's a lot of other priorities on the table. And we have seen this lurching of attention from thing to thing. It was Venezuela, then it's been Iran, which means Gaza hasn't received sufficient attention. Lebanon has received some attention, but these things only work with sustained pressure and engagement. So that's number one. And number two, I think the Iranians consistently are overly confident in what they have achieved. Part of that is because this is an authoritarian ideological regime who needs to project a certain narrative to its own people and to itself. And part of it is that what they need to do is survive, and they believe that they have survived this war. Our incentive structure is very different. And finally, whether or not Iran is actually able to carve back a position of significant regional influence will depend upon how our partners approach it. If they lose confidence in U.S. commitment, security investments, and willingness to see this through, our partners are going to cut their own deals of accommodation with Iran in order to put their interests first. And I worry that we're already seeing this sprinkle out, and I don't know that we can put that back in the box.
And I'm sure we'll have a discussion specifically about these partners, coming up, in part because things that are just details in this conflict, like the fact that Iran has, for the first time in decades, fired upon all these countries. The fact that the UAE left OPEC amid all of this, which would have been a huge story at any other time, but it was just kind of, Tuesday's news in the context of this conflict. I mean, these are all things which will have consequences going forward. Rob, what do you think?
So I think Dana is right that one of the main key variables is the attention span of the president and the administration and their ability to stay the course when we move to a next phase. In answer to your question, I would not trade our situation for Iran's. Iran and its partners, the Iranian team, took a huge battering. I mean, let's remember the Saudis, the Emiratis, they all did that attempt to have a deal with Iran before the war. There was a Saudi-Iranian reconciliation. The Emiratis thought they had a business arrangement with the Iranians, and the Iranians said, just shoved that all away. I think those partners know down at their core the Iranians cannot be trusted. I think they are going to, yes, they will look for other partners, but ultimately the United States is going to be their security partner. Hopefully we can rise to that challenge. But I think that they know that the Iranians are on the prowl. They are alive to this, and hopefully we can take advantage of this moment to deepen our alliances, Arabs and Israelis, strengthen military cooperation, and be better prepared for when there is another round, because that's who the Iranians are. There will be another round.
Well, folks, we're going to leave it there. Deal or no deal, there's going to be plenty more news to talk about. So thanks for joining us today. I hope you'll continue to join us as we have more of these discussions going forward. Thanks very much from the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. I'm Mike Singh, joined by Rob Statloff and Dana Stroll. Thanks very much. Have a good afternoon.